My wife went to the company couple's dinner with her lover. While she dressed, choosing the best perfume, the highest heels, the most provocative lipstick, smiling in the mirror as if she were about to live out a teenage fantasy, I was in the living room office, typing the last line of the divorce letter. I knew. Her every gesture over the past few months screamed the truth she hadn't had the courage to tell me. The constant delays. The forced laughter on the phone. The coldness in bed. The absence in her eyes. And now, this dinner, a company couple's only event, an invitation she didn't even bother pretending to share with me. She had already chosen who she would go with. The letter was on the dining table when she returned. I was no longer there. And my absence was the only response she deserved. I took only a suitcase. I left no notes, no explanations. The pain she caused was so clear that any words would be useless. I loved her. And she knew it. I loved her with the strength of someone who believed that love was commitment, construction, presence. I loved her even when she no longer looked at me tenderly. And perhaps that was precisely why it hurt so much. Love didn't die, it was murdered. And the crime was silent, but brutal. When she saw the letter, she was in shock. She searched the house, the closets, the scent on her pillow. But I was gone. She called me, texted me, cried in voicemails. No response. And yet, even in the face of the chaos she herself created, she didn't pursue him. She decided to stay with him. Maybe she thought that fleeting passion would bear the weight of her choice. Maybe she thought I would return. Or that time would heal everything. But time has a curious flaw, it doesn't heal what was never true. And with time, she would discover this in the cruelest of ways. She moved on with her lover. And I moved on with the pain. It took me a while to get up. I tried to understand. I tried to hate her. But nothing filled the void. Until one day, tired of finding justification for her cowardice, I began to live. For real. I met people. Some wounded. Others with stories as broken as mine. But, between failed encounters and comfortable silences, I found the mirror again. And in the reflection, I saw a man who no longer carried guilt. I saw someone who deserved to be loved, again. But in a different way. In a clean way. Their affair didn't last long. Maybe months. Maybe weeks. I don't know exactly. What I do know is that he pulled away, like all those who come only for desire. She tried other relationships. None lasted. None compared to what I offered. She realized, too late, that love isn't the adrenaline of secret encounters. Love is caring, it's permanence, it's wanting to be there when everything is falling apart. But there, amid the shadows of the life she chose, she began to reap what she sowed, men who only wanted her body, empty dinners with plastic smiles, ignored messages, broken promises. She realized that no one looked at her the way I did. That no one listened to her the way I listened to her. That no one bore her pain the way I did. She began to miss not only me, but the version of herself that existed by my side. Pride held her back. But pain began to push her back. And one day, she decided to look for me. She found me. In a square, with a woman by my side and a child in my arms. A light smile on my face. The peace she'd never seen in me when we were still together. She watched me from afar. She waited. And after a few weeks, she summoned the courage to call me. She offered 1,000 excuses. She said she regretted it. That it was never love with him. That she missed me. That she understood now. That she wanted to try again. And I listened to her. Carefully. With serenity. And when she finished, I took a deep breath. I smiled. And I said that the love she wasted today was what built the foundation of my new life. She cried. She asked me for another chance. But there was no longer room for her. The door she herself had closed was now locked by time. And by choices. In the days that followed, she tried to regain control of her life. But the past was an uncomfortable mirror. Everywhere she looked, she saw my absence. And no matter how hard she tried to deceive herself, nothing filled her. She began to avoid mirrors. To isolate herself. To lose herself in her own thoughts. She tried to convince herself it was just a mistake. But deep down, she knew, it was a decision. And decisions have consequences. The cruelest of them, losing the man who loved her most. One day, in a conversation with a friend, she tearfully confessed, "I traded love for an illusion. And now love lives with someone else, while I live with the memory of what I destroyed." And that phrase echoed for a long time. She discovered that true love is rare. And that pride is a silent poison. She tried to distract herself with new faces, new bars, new trips. But the feeling was always the same upon returning home, a growing emptiness. An irremediable longing. One night, with no hope of reconciliation, she opened an old box of letters and mementos. There, she found photos, messages, notes from me. And in an envelope yellowed with age, there was a piece of paper she had never seen. It was a letter. A letter I wrote days before the betrayal, in which I planned a surprise trip for us both. I wanted to rekindle what we had lost. I wanted to fight. She never knew that. She never had the chance to see how much I loved her. Or maybe she did, and didn't want to see it. Upon reading that letter, she fell to the floor, sobbing. It was in that moment that she understood, the love she lost had been there all along. But she chose the risk, the adrenaline, the mistake. That was the longest night of her life. She slept on the living room floor, hugging a letter that arrived too late. She woke alone. As she had for the past few months. As she would be from then on. She tried to write to me. She tried to call. Not out of insistence, but out of desperation. I didn't answer. Not out of revenge. But because it no longer made sense. Her chapter in my story was over. And the new story I was writing now was full of peace, reciprocity, and love. But fate, ironic and cruel, had even more in store. An unexpected reunion. A revelation she never imagined. A painful coincidence that would make her relive everything all over again. Because there are things time can't erase. There are mistakes that can't be mended. And there are loves that never return. And just when she thought she'd felt all the pain, something happened. Something that would forever change the way she remembered me. Now only one question remains: what was it that she saw, that made her understand, once and for all, that she would never again have the man who loved her? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal. All the stories told are fictional, but they carry deep truths about how infidelity can destroy homes, loves and entire lives. The goal is to show, with intensity and realism, that those who betray always pay a price, sooner or later. Get ready now to hear a shocking, intense and unforgettable story. Jonathan and Melissa met in their early adulthood, when everything was still a dream and their feet were barely touching the ground. He worked as a supervisor at a food distribution company, already well established in his career, while she was studying business administration and interning at a digital marketing agency. Their meeting was almost accidental, a scheduling conflict, a misdelivery of materials, an email exchange that turned into phone calls and then into conversations that went beyond professional matters. Melissa, always practical and ambitious, found something in Jonathan that made her slow down. There was a solid calm about him, a mature confidence that contrasted with the chaos she usually lived in. He, in turn, saw in her an energy he hadn't felt in anyone for a long time. There was life in her eyes, intensity in her gestures, a laugh that filled the room and made people look, even if only surreptitiously. And this unsettled him in a way he thought he'd forgotten what it was like. It didn't take long for their relationship to move beyond coincidence and become a reality. Together, they bought a small but cozy apartment. It was high up in a building overlooking the train tracks, which might have bothered others, but for them, it became almost a soundtrack to their everyday lives. Little by little, they filled their home with silent symbols of affection, the plants Melissa insisted on caring for, even without much talent, Jonathan's books scattered across the shelves, the Italian coffee maker they used on Sundays as a lazy morning ritual. Between short trips and series watched under the same blanket, they built what they called their real life. Without grand promises, but with the daily dedication of those who know that love lies in repetition, in the small gestures that add up to form what is considered home. In the early years, the connection between them was almost symbiotic. Jonathan had a loving way of caring, of listening attentively to even the mundane details of Melissa's day. And she, who had always been a whirlwind of words, found in him the listening ear she never had at home. Her parents had separated when she was still a child, and she grew up between different homes, with broken routines and promises that were rarely kept. Jonathan, by contrast, came from a stable family, with long Sunday dinners and parents who still held hands. Perhaps that was why he believed so strongly in love as a conscious choice, not just a feeling, but constancy, presence, loyalty. Over time, Melissa graduated and landed a good position at a mid-sized marketing agency. Her routine became more demanding, with longer hours, quick lunches, and tiring nights. Jonathan continued working the same job, which, though simple, provided him with a certain emotional peace of mind. And although there were days when the grind took its toll, they still tried to keep their connection alive. Sometimes this came in the form of notes left on the refrigerator door, other times in small, impromptu dinners, or even in pre-planned trips. There was affection, there was effort. Most of all, there was a desire to stay. 3 years into their marriage, they decided it was time for a change. They sold their apartment and rented a house in a quieter neighborhood, with a small backyard and enough space for both of them to work from home. Jonathan renovated the back room to set up his office, while Melissa used the living room as a base for her consultations. The walls were adorned with new paintings, chosen by her, and the kitchen was given a rustic table he restored himself. The move brought a new lease of life, a sense that they were entering a more mature, more structured phase. Friends started asking about children. They laughed, avoided the subject, and said they were still enjoying their time together. But it was clear that time passed differently for each of them. Jonathan seemed increasingly invested in the idea of stability. He made plans to open a small shop with a friend, talked about retirement, and how to better invest their money. Melissa, meanwhile, talked about conferences, travel, and opportunities for growth within the agency. There was a subtle disconnect there, but neither of them would name it. They were simply paths crossing in different ways. And yet there was love. And laughter. And touch. And care. So neither of them saw it as a problem, at least, not at that stage. As Melissa's career progressed, invitations to events, courses, and, most importantly, more time away from home came along. Jonathan understood and encouraged her. He was never the controlling type, and he was always proud of the strong, independent woman he married. But there were nights when he ate dinner alone, staring at her still untouched plate. There were Sundays when the bed seemed too big. Even so, he didn't complain. He preferred to think it was part of the phase. That she would return. That it was just a cycle. Melissa, for her part, felt alive. Her profession gave her a sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. There was recognition, praise, goals achieved. And although she still loved Jonathan, she began to realize that the love she felt now was calmer, less electric. There was no longer that urgency, that butterflies in her stomach. It was a calm affection, which sometimes seemed to be confused with friendship. She tried not to think about it too much. After all, he was good. He was present. He was the man she wanted to build a life with. But something in her heart was beginning to stir, as if a part of her was asking for something she couldn't name. At the agency, a new campaign required full-time dedication for 2 months. Melissa took over leadership of the team and began to live almost exclusively around the project. She would arrive late, eat dinner alone, and fall asleep before Jonathan returned to his room. Communication between them, previously so fluid, began to become objective, almost bureaucratic. Messages about the market, bill reminders, quick questions about the day. There was still affection, but now it was hidden behind obligations. Despite this, Jonathan maintained his rituals. He made her coffee on her most tired mornings, left notes when she needed to leave early, picked up flowers on Saturdays when he felt the week had been too much. He wasn't perfect, but he was consistent. And that, for a while, seemed enough. On weekends, he insisted on doing something together, a walk in the park, an old movie on the couch, anything that would reconnect them. And sometimes, he succeeded. There were nights when Melissa would give in, laughing at silly jokes, cuddling in his lap. On those nights, he believed everything was okay. That they were just going through a phase. That the love, even silent, was still there. Once, during dinner with friends, someone asked what the secret was to a marriage lasting so long. Jonathan answered without thinking twice, "It's wanting to be here, even when it's easier to leave." Melissa just smiled. She didn't say anything. But that phrase kept lingering inside you for days. He began to wonder if he still wanted to be here. And the doubt frightened her more than the answer. The house, once alive with laughter and conversation, grew quieter. The bed grew colder. The days grew longer. Melissa became increasingly absorbed in her professional life. Jonathan became increasingly introspective, keeping to himself the anxieties he didn't want to become burdens. And amidst this silent abyss, something began to slip away. Love, which had once been a presence, began to transform into an absence disguised as routine. Hands that once sought each other instinctively now touched only out of habit. Eyes that once recognized each other began to drift away. There was still affection, yes. But the desire to share life seemed to be diluted, day after day, by the absence of time, presence, and intention. The couple who once dreamed together were now walking in different directions without realizing it. Each trapped in their own urgencies. Each fueling the other's silence with their own absence. What neither knew was that soon, something would happen. Something that would completely change the course of their story. Something that would begin as a whisper, and end as an earthquake. Spring arrived without much notice in that house where silence had already become part of the decor. The changing seasons, which had once been a reason for outdoor dinners and plans for short trips, now went unnoticed. Jonathan continued his days with the same calm and predictable routine. I would wake up early, make coffee, read the news on my tablet, and gaze out the window for long minutes before starting work. In the late afternoon, I would walk around the neighborhood with headphones on, as if the world around me could be drowned out by the music. Melissa, on the other hand, was immersing herself deeper and deeper in her new role as digital campaign coordinator. Her messages became increasingly spaced out, her glances more vacant, her replies automatic. There were still moments of normalcy between them, a midweek dinner, a joke rescued from the past, a movie started but not finished, but these moments were increasingly rare, like small sighs between long periods of emotional apnea. One afternoon, Melissa received a message. It was from a new employee at the agency, recently hired to lead the creative department. His name was Daniel. The tone was informal, direct, but not intrusive. He praised her for the way she'd handled the presentation of the new campaign and suggested they discuss next steps in more detail at a cafe near the agency. At first, Melissa didn't see anything wrong with it. She was married, busy, and it was just work. But she accepted the invitation. Perhaps it was an opportunity to align ideas, to streamline processes. Perhaps it was also an escape, a break from the silent burden she carried every day. During the meeting, the two talked about goals and deadlines, but also laughed about everyday situations, exchanged confidences about the agency environment, mentioned travel, movies, and, subtly, personal stories. Daniel was charismatic, articulate, and had a sense of humor that made Melissa relax, momentarily forgetting the responsibilities weighing on her shoulders. When she returned home that night, she found Jonathan asleep on the couch with the television on low. He felt a tightness in his chest, a mixture of tenderness and guilt, but he couldn't explain why. In the following weeks, her meetings with Daniel became more frequent, always under the guise of work. Meetings that began with spreadsheets and ended with smiles that were too long. Messages after hours, late-night audio messages, small flirtations disguised as pleasantries. Melissa sensed what was happening, but avoided naming it. She told herself it was just neediness, that it was just a phase. That I would do nothing but talk. But the body has its own language, and desire speaks before thought. One evening, under the pretense of reviewing a proposal together, she went to Daniel's apartment. And there, in the unfamiliar and exciting space of a place that held no history of marriage, she surrendered herself. His touch was different. Not better, not more tender, just different. And perhaps that was exactly what attracted her. The new. The unshared. The forbidden. The next morning, Melissa couldn't look at her reflection without feeling the weight of a seemingly insoluble mess. She knew what she had done. She knew she had overstepped her bounds. And he also knew Jonathan didn't deserve this. Yet, instead of confronting the guilt, he decided to repress it. He told himself it had been a one-time mistake. That it would never happen again. But it did. More than once. And with each new encounter, the gulf between her and Jonathan grew silently. He was still attentive, though he no longer showed it as often. Her absence, even without words, was felt in every cold plate, every broken bed, every vacant look during dinner. Jonathan was never naive. He saw the signs, but clung to the hope that everything would fall into place. I would rather not believe the worst. I would rather think she was just tired, overwhelmed. That it was just another phase. One day, when he arrived home early from work, he found the room tidy, Melissa's personal belongings intact, but her cell phone, forgotten on the office desk, flashing with frequent notifications. On impulse, or perhaps an instinct that had been screaming for days, he unlocked the device. He didn't have to look far. The conversations were there. The photos. The audios. The scheduled dates. The compliments. The laughter. Jonathan felt the ground drop from under his feet. His blood ran cold. His breath faltered. He ran his hands over his face, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. The silence of the house, until then a companion, was now a muffled scream. He sat in the armchair, cell phone still in hand, and read each line as if watching a life crumble in slow motion. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just stood there, still, trying to assimilate the reality that, though intuited, was now undeniable. That night, Melissa returned to find Jonathan calm, even too serene. He watched her silently as she dropped her bag on the couch, took off her shoes, and commented on something trivial about the traffic. For the first time in weeks, she noticed his eyes. There was an absence there, a suppressed sadness, an unspoken goodbye. They ate dinner in silence. They slept in the same room, but on opposite sides of the bed, separated by a chasm that was no longer invisible. In the following days, Jonathan said nothing. He continued his routine as normal. But inside, something had changed irreversibly. Meanwhile, Daniel began to show more involvement than Melissa expected. He sent longer messages, suggested more frequent meetings, and made plans. And this bothered her. What had once seemed light and unpretentious was now beginning to take on a weight she wasn't willing to carry. He began taking longer to respond, avoiding conversations outside of business hours, and declining invitations with flimsy excuses. Daniel, perceptive, understood. He tried to insist. He questioned. He asked for explanations. But Melissa, confused and frightened, began to pull away without convincing explanations. What had seemed like a leak began to turn into a prison. And she no longer knew which side she wanted to be on. Jonathan, meanwhile, was planning. Not revenge. But a fresh start. He began organizing the wedding papers, reviewing documents, listing assets, and reviewing accounts. He wrote a letter. Not long, but precise. Clear. Direct. Impossible to be misinterpreted. A farewell without shouting, but with truth. That same week, he decided to leave home. He didn't take much. Just enough for a little time away, until everything was formalized. He left the letter on the dining table, with the ring on top. And he left. He didn't look back. When Melissa arrived that night, the house was eerily quiet. The lights were off, the rooms in order. She called for Jonathan. No answer. She saw the letter. She read it. And the impact was immediate. She felt her legs weaken, her stomach churn. She tried calling. No answer. She texted. None were seen. She ran through the rooms, as if he were hiding somewhere. But he wasn't. And in that instant, she understood what she had lost. For days, Melissa tried to contact him. She visited friends, looked in places she used to go. Nothing. The silence was now hers. A piercing, irreversible emptiness. And yet, she didn't urgently pursue him. She didn't explicitly apologize. She continued living, or at least tried. She kept her job, followed her routine. Daniel disappeared from her life as quickly as he'd appeared. And she was left with the echo of what she'd destroyed. She tried other relationships, brief, fleeting. No man looked at her the way Jonathan did. None cared about her quirks, her weaknesses, her silence. They were cold encounters, shallow conversations. A parade of presences that only reinforced his absence. Time passed. And one morning, Melissa woke with a strange feeling in her chest. A tightness that didn't come from outside, but from within. A belated regret, like a pain that had been dormant and suddenly awakened with fury. She decided to look for him. Find him. Tell him she understood now. That she was willing to rebuild. But what he found wasn't what he expected. And in that moment, before she could even say a word, she knew she had arrived too late. What Melissa saw, and what paralyzed her for long minutes, was more than a new beginning. It was a new life. Complete. Serene. And in that moment, she knew, the true punishment wasn't the guilt. It was the contrast. It was seeing what you lost blossom somewhere else. And worst of all, I still had no idea what was to come. Melissa wasn't sure why she insisted on saving his number, even after so many months of absence and silence. It was as if, by keeping that contact available, even if silent, she also maintained a tiny trace of hope that perhaps, one day, he would hear her. That night, sitting on the sofa in the living room they once shared, now empty of any trace of him, she couldn't resist. She wrote a short message. A sentence that carried the weight of months of pent-up regret: "We need to talk, please." She didn't expect a reply. But she received one. Almost immediately. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. Café St. Clair. Her heart raced. Her hands trembled. Her mind, which until then had been searching for arguments and justifications, went blank. She didn't know exactly what she was going to say. She only knew she needed to see him. That she needed to try. The next morning, she arrived early. She chose a table in the corner and ordered a coffee that went cold without being touched. She was restless, fidgeting with her hands and hair, glancing at the door every 2 seconds. When he entered, the air seemed to shift. Jonathan was different. There was a strange calm on his face, but also a firmness she hadn't recognized. He approached with firm steps and sat down across from her without saying a word, just with a polite nod. Melissa tried to smile, but the gesture died before it could fully form. She began speaking softly, her voice trembling. She said she didn't know where to begin, that the days without him had been too long, that her silence before was fear, not contempt. She spoke of the sleepless nights, of the longing for simple things, of the regret that ate away at her. Jonathan listened silently, without interrupting, but without softening his gaze. When she finally fell silent, he took a deep breath and said there was no more room to go back. That the pain he felt had transformed into something different. That he had already moved on. She then asked, hesitantly, if there was anyone else. Jonathan looked away for a moment before answering, but not to hesitate, only to avoid hurting her with the direct weight of the truth. He said yes. That there was someone. That he was happy. Melissa swallowed hard. I wanted to ask more, but I knew I had no right. But then, as if something inside her needed an answer, she took the chance. I wanted to know when it had started. If it was before or after their breakup. Jonathan looked at her for a few seconds before saying firmly that it was after. Much after. He said he was afraid to love again. That he didn't want it, that he wasn't looking for it. But life sometimes offers peace where before there was only ruin. Melissa lowered her eyes. She felt ashamed. She felt a physical pain, as if her chest were tightening inside. And then, unsure where the courage came from, she asked if she could meet her. Jonathan didn't answer right away. He simply looked into her eyes and asked, in a calm voice, if she was sure she wanted to see him. She nodded hesitantly. He then asked her to follow him. They left the cafe in silence. They walked for 2 blocks. When they turned the corner onto a tree-lined street, she saw it. Across the sidewalk, in front of a small school, a woman smiled beside a child playing with a wooden toy car. Melissa didn't recognize the woman immediately, but there was something familiar in her features, in the way she smiled, in the way she bent down to adjust the child's cap. Jonathan waved to her from afar, and in response, the woman smiled back tenderly. Melissa looked at the child. A boy of about 4. He ran toward Jonathan, shouting, "Daddy," with joy. Jonathan lifted him into the air and hugged him tightly, like someone who leaves no doubt about belonging. The woman approached with light steps, holding a bag of snacks. When she stopped beside them, Melissa finally understood. It was Clara. A college friend. One of the few she had completely ignored over the years. Clara was sweet, reserved, and had always shown admiration for Melissa and Jonathan's relationship. But she never got too close. Never crossed the line into cordiality. Clara was now the woman who loved Jonathan. And the boy, although not his biological son, called him father with the conviction of someone who knew true love from an early age. Melissa stood still. Jonathan, holding the boy in his arms, approached her. Calmly, he said he wanted her to know the truth, not out of revenge, but because she deserved to understand what had really happened. He said he'd run into Clara months after the separation, by chance, in a bookstore. She was with her son, recently separated from an abusive relationship. They began talking. First, about books. Then, about children. About life. About wounds. Jonathan said he saw in Clara a rare honesty. A serenity that needed no words to comfort. Over time, they grew closer. He met her son, Pedro. And, without realizing it, he began to care for them as if they were his own family. Melissa tried to hold back her tears. But when she heard Jonathan say that Pedro had taught him how to be a father again, even though he'd never had children of his own, she broke down. She cried there, standing on the sidewalk, her life spinning around her, but her world coming to a complete standstill. She apologized. Not with mechanical words, but with the pain that escaped her eyes. She said she never imagined he could be a father, that she always knew he would have been a great one. Jonathan nodded. He said that perhaps he was indeed destined to be, just for another child, in another life, with another woman. Clara, who had been watching from afar, noticed the tension and approached. She extended her hand to Melissa, with a polite but respectful gesture. Melissa returned the gesture, even though she trembled. For the first time, she looked into Clara's eyes and saw what Jonathan saw, truth. The child looked at the two women with the innocence of someone who doesn't understand their bonds but senses their intentions. He nestled into Jonathan's arms, smiling, calling him daddy again, and in that moment, Melissa understood. It wasn't just about having lost him. It was about what he had become after her. The peace she could never offer. The love she never knew how to cultivate. Their farewell was silent. Jonathan walked her to the corner. He said he sincerely hoped she would find her way. That he wished her no harm, only distance. Melissa simply waved, voiceless, powerless. She walked home alone. And when she entered, she sat on the sofa and stared at the walls for hours. That afternoon, she decided not to try anymore. Not to insist on rewriting a story that had already ended. Because now she knew, with all possible clarity, that the true punishment wasn't the absence. It was the contrast. Seeing the man who loved her become everything she had ever valued, and to someone else. And worst of all, now, finally, she understood that no other man would ever look at her the way he did. And that no future love would be able to heal what she had destroyed. That same night, Melissa couldn't sleep. The walls of the house that had once been hers and Jonathan seemed to shrink around her, slowly crushing her with the weight of everything unsaid, everything done and now beyond repair. The image of Jonathan holding Pedro, smiling with a lightness she'd never seen in him, resurfaced every time she closed her eyes. The way he looked at Clara, with that sincere calm, with the assurance of someone who no longer carried any resentment, was what destroyed her most. It wasn't anger, nor indifference. It was overcoming. He had overcome not only the pain of betrayal, but also the love he felt for her. And that truth hurt more than any rejection. It was the end. A true end. Irreversible. In the days that followed, Melissa tried to keep herself busy. She immersed herself in work with an almost desperate intensity, extending her hours, taking on projects she would have otherwise refused, traveling for work as a way to escape herself. But in every airport, every hotel, every quiet room, Jonathan's name lingered like a persistent whisper. And even in the loudest meetings, the most praised presentations, she felt empty. Messages from friends became scarce. Social media, once filled with happy memories and achievements, was now just silent observations of other people's lives. And every now and then, she saw a photo of Jonathan with Clara and Pedro, in a park, at a coffee shop, on her doorstep, and it was like being hit by an invisible blow to the gut. One rainy, gray Saturday afternoon, she went to visit her mother, something she didn't do often. They sat on the covered porch, drinking hot tea, while the sound of rain filled the spaces left by the silence. After a few minutes, her mother, who had always been a man of few words, commented gently, "You're different. You're quieter, with tired eyes." Melissa didn't respond immediately. She just looked at the ground, clutching her cup tightly. Her mother sighed. She said she remembered when Melissa was little and would make a point of holding her hand when crossing any street, even when she could already walk alone. "You trusted people too much, daughter. And sometimes that trust leads us down bad paths, especially when we don't know what we're looking for." Melissa felt tears well up in her eyes, but she didn't cry. She was tired of crying. Tired of feeling. The following week, she received an unexpected invitation, Pedro's birthday party. Clara sent the message. She was polite, kind, and said she understood if Melissa didn't want to or couldn't attend, but that Jonathan thought it would be important. Melissa took 2 days to respond. Finally, she accepted. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was a gesture of humility. Or just another desperate attempt to at least regain some semblance of dignity. She arrived at the party venue, a small, simply decorated farmhouse, and took her time getting out of the car. She took a deep breath. She touched up her lipstick. She adjusted her hair. And finally, she went inside. She saw Jonathan from afar, handing out party favors to the children, smiling as if everything was exactly where it should be. Pedro ran among the guests, with a wide smile and bright eyes. Clara chatted with Jonathan's parents, both visibly at ease with her. Melissa walked toward the group with measured steps. She was greeted cordially. Jonathan greeted her with a polite kiss on the cheek. Clara offered a glass of juice with a respectful smile. No visible tension. No hostility. But there was an invisible wall between them, built by everything that couldn't be said in that context. At the end of the party, as the guests began to leave, Melissa offered to help collect the gifts from the table. They were alone for a few minutes on the porch. She took a deep breath and said, "He's an amazing boy." Jonathan thanked her with a small smile. She hesitated, then continued, "And you are fine. Better than I imagined." Jonathan nodded. He said that life doesn't always take us where we plan, but that sometimes that's exactly what we need. Melissa then stared at him for a moment. Her eyes searched for some opening, some sign of fragility. But there was none. There was only peace. It was then that she finally found the courage to ask what she'd always wanted to know but never had the strength to face, "Have you forgiven me?" Jonathan took a moment to answer. He looked up at the sky for a few seconds before saying, "Forgiving isn't forgetting. Nor accepting. It's understanding. And I understood. I understood that you weren't happy. That you sought outside for what you perhaps didn't even know you needed. But I also understood that I gave everything. That I loved with everything I had. And that frees me." Melissa felt a lump in her throat. She tried to hold it back, but the tears came. There was no hiding it anymore. Jonathan moved a little closer, but maintained a safe distance. He said he sincerely wanted her to be happy. That she would find someone who truly loved her. But that she first needed to love herself enough not to sabotage herself. Melissa nodded silently. Just as they were about to say goodbye, Clara appeared, calling Jonathan to take one last photo with Pedro. Before leaving, Jonathan turned and said, "Oh, there's something you might not know." Melissa looked at him, surprised by his light tone. "That trip I wanted to take with you, that surprise I never told you." She nodded. Jonathan continued, "We were supposed to go to Greece. I had bought the tickets. I had planned an itinerary. I was supposed to ask you to renew our vows there. But the day I was going to tell you, I found out everything." Melissa froze. Her heart seemed to stop for a second. Jonathan gave a slight, sad smile, turned, and walked toward his new family. Melissa stood there, alone, the sky now clear, but with a storm raging inside her chest. That simple yet devastating piece of information was the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just love she'd lost. It was the future. It was what could have been. It was a journey that never happened, a request that was never made, a gesture of love that died before it could be born. For the first time, she understood the true weight of betrayal. It wasn't just the mistake. It was what was being destroyed along with it. That night, lying in bed, Melissa finally understood that some choices have consequences that cannot be reversed. And what hurt was no longer the loss of Jonathan. It was knowing that he had been the best chapter of her life, and she had written the end with her own hands. Melissa walked home as if crossing a minefield, each step weighed down by someone who no longer knows where the ground is and where the abyss begins. She couldn't think clearly, nor organize the chaos that now overflowed from within, and it seemed the silence of the walls screamed louder than any memory. That last revelation, delivered with the brutal calm that only resolute hearts can muster, had shattered any hope. The journey that never happened. The promise that died before it could be made. This was the portrait of what she had destroyed. It wasn't just the betrayal itself, it was what she had interrupted. It was the silent love that had been suffocated by her own haste, by distractions, and by the lack of listening. There was no going back. There was nothing left to mend. But still, it was impossible to simply carry on as if everything had never been experienced. Emptiness isn't absence. Emptiness is frozen memory. In the days that followed, she became someone at odds with her own body. It was as if she were watching herself fulfill obligations, smile at the right moments, respond to emails as efficiently as ever, but all of this done by a mechanical, uninhabited version of herself. Inside her, something no longer moved. She had gone from being a woman seeking reconciliation to a woman in mourning. And mourning isn't just for the other, it's for what you were and will never be again. It's for the life that never comes back. She began to look at old photos, not out of longing, but out of a need to remember the woman she once was by Jonathan's side, to understand where she'd lost herself. And the more she looked at them, the harder it was to sustain the pride, the denial, the idea that it was all an emotional accident. It wasn't. There had been decisions. There had been negligence. There had been conscious choices to walk away from someone who did everything to stay. The cruelest thing was that she now understood every detail. She knew he waited for her on nights when she said she was exhausted. She knew he continued cooking on Sundays even when she ate out. She knew he stopped complaining when he realized she wasn't listening anymore. And now she understood that he loved her even in the silences. Even when she herself no longer knew if she deserved it. Jonathan hadn't given up first. She was the one who started leaving before he left. And that's unforgivable. Not because he was incapable of forgiving, but because he had already left inside. He held no grudges. He held lessons. And he had learned, finally, that love isn't about constant sacrifice. Love is also about reciprocity. A moral dilemma began to dominate Melissa's thoughts. Should she withdraw completely from his life and respect his new story, or should she insist, even silently, on some kind of future redemption? Part of her wanted to move on, rebuild her life, seek other paths. But another part, deeper, more human and wounded, knew she might never love like that again. And did she deserve, after all, to have that kind of love again? Life seemed to have imposed a definitive lesson on her, one of those that scars the soul, and now she needed to understand what to do with this pain. Would she allow herself to be transformed by it, or would she simply hide in empty distractions, pretending that time would heal something she herself didn't want to forget? On a cloudy Saturday, he decided to do something he'd long avoided. He visited their old neighborhood. He passed the house where they'd lived for 3 years. The windows were different, the curtains were new, but the structure was the same. The front steps, the small side garden, the porch where so many conversations had taken place. She didn't dare knock. She just stood there, across the street, observing the facade, like someone visiting the tomb of something no longer part of the living. There, he let a few tears fall without trying to hold them back. He felt it was a symbolic final point. A silent goodbye. No longer for him. But for her. For the woman who was there. For the life that could have continued and was shattered by the sum total of wrong choices. In the following weeks, Melissa began to try to rebuild herself. She no longer sought Jonathan. She didn't seek further explanations. She began therapy, something she had always put off. In the sessions, she spoke little at first, but gradually began to listen to herself more honestly. She discovered that her insecurity, often disguised as autonomy, made her sabotage deep bonds. That a childhood divided between homes, between shallow affections, between silences and departures, had taught her that stability was synonymous with suffocation. That, without realizing it, when she found true love, she feared it. And because she feared it, she wanted to prove she still had control. That she was still free. But in the end, she was a prisoner of her own escapes. The days began to have a rhythm again. Not the same as before, but with a different cadence. She began reading more, resuming old hobbies. She rediscovered the pleasure of cooking for herself, of walking slowly, of being alone without feeling lonely. Not because she had forgotten Jonathan, but because, for the first time, she was learning to live with his absence without making it a torment. It was a way of honoring what she had experienced. Of accepting that some people come into our lives not to stay forever, but to teach us truths that we carry with us forever. Jonathan, for his part, was experiencing a serene phase. With Clara, the relationship was mature, gentle, built on mutual respect and sincerity. He knew he would never experience the same with her as he had with Melissa, not for lack of love, but because different loves build different lives. With Clara, he found a calm kind of love, without the emotional ups and downs, without the heavy silences. A love built on small gestures, on shared routines, on caring for Pedro, on the nights when the boy asked to hear stories and he invented new worlds just to see the boy's eyes shine. Even amidst the peace, Jonathan sometimes thought of Melissa. Not with longing or regret, but with compassion. He knew she had lost herself in the process of searching for something she didn't even understand. And that perhaps that was the greatest tragedy, not knowing what you're looking for until you lose what you had. But he also knew that to forgive was to move on. And he did. He created new memories. New Sundays. New hugs. Love didn't die with the pain, it simply transformed. One afternoon, while returning from a walk with Clara and Pedro, they stopped at a used book fair. Pedro excitedly chose a children's book about a bird who had lost his family but, after many flights and discoveries, found his place in another nest. Jonathan smiled at the choice. He picked up the book and read the last sentence aloud to Clara, laughing, "Sometimes, what seems like the end is just the beginning of a home that was waiting for us." She hugged him tenderly. And in that moment, he knew that love isn't what survives the storm, it's what emerges after it. Across town, Melissa was writing. She started an anonymous blog. In it, she talked about feelings, losses, and the difficulty of facing one's own flaws. Her profound and painful writing began to gain readers. People who identified with her, who felt understood. It was as if, by exposing her pain, she was helping others heal theirs. And for the first time, she realized that perhaps she could still build something beautiful from the ruins. Not with the intention of replacing the past, but of transforming pain into truth. And truth, even when bitter, is the only place where one can begin anew. Melissa's reconstruction wasn't quick, nor was it linear. There were setbacks, difficult days, desires to call, to try again. But over time, she learned to stay with herself. To stop hiding behind excuses. To accept that the pain she caused also transformed who she was. And this transformation, slow and real, was her form of redemption. Not to win Jonathan back. But to finally look in the mirror and recognize herself. To, perhaps one day, be able to love again, and this time, with presence, with listening, with truth. Because some mistakes are irreversible. But they have a path. And the path, however long, can lead to places where peace is possible. She just needed to follow. With scars, yes. But also with courage. Time, with its silent and relentless way of transforming everything, passed slowly over Melissa's life, but it didn't ease its scars. The pain was no longer acute, but had become a kind of constant, discreet companion, whispering memories in the most unthinkable moments. She continued rebuilding her routine with dignity, but also with a certain emptiness that neither new habits nor attempts to open up to others could fill. The blog, now better known, received hundreds of comments from anonymous readers, touched by her sincere reflections on choices, regrets, and the side effects of hasty decisions. Melissa never signed her posts with her real name, nor did she intend to. There was something liberating in hiding behind faceless honesty, as if it allowed her to face her flaws with more courage than she would in front of a mirror. One night, after publishing a text about love that fades not for lack of feeling, but for excessive carelessness, she received a direct message from one of her readers, signed simply as V. The message said that the story described exactly what he had felt years before, having been left by someone who swore eternal love but couldn't stay. It also said that, although the pain was inevitable, it had become a bridge to a stronger, more honest version of himself. Melissa was reluctant to respond, but something in that message caught her attention. They began exchanging words. At first, short, polite, like someone feeling their way into a still unknown place. Then came the audio messages. The confidences. And as the weeks passed, V became Victor. A man who had also lost, but who hadn't become a hostage to the loss. And, like her, he now walked over his own fragments with greater awareness. Rediscovering the possibility of human connection was daunting at first. Melissa hesitated about everything, the tone of her messages, the compliments she received, her desire to laugh spontaneously again. But Victor didn't demand haste or forced presence. He simply listened. He responded calmly. He shared his own pain, without turning the conversation into a competition of sadness. Over time, Melissa began to realize that perhaps there was still room within her for something new. Not the same. Never the same. But something born of acceptance of imperfection. And no longer of trying to appear whole while bleeding inside. Months later, they decided to meet in person. They chose a discreet, dimly lit restaurant with large windows and soft music. When she first saw him, Melissa felt butterflies in her stomach she hadn't felt in years, not the kind of butterflies of urgent passion, but the nervousness of knowing something real might begin. Dinner was relaxed, filled with sincere pauses between sentences, where the silences weren't awkward, but comfortable. Victor was a widower. He told her about the woman he lost to a silly but devastating domestic accident. He said he'd long felt guilty for not being home that day, for not insisting she use another staircase. Melissa didn't judge. She listened with her eyes, with her whole body. And when she spoke of Jonathan, it wasn't as someone reliving heartache, but as someone recognizing the depth of a love that taught more in its absence than in its presence. In subsequent meetings, the two grew closer with respect. Nothing was forced. Victor read the blog posts with devotion, sometimes recognizing in them phrases Melissa had already uttered in a low voice. He didn't try to heal her, nor did he occupy the space left by Jonathan. He simply shared the journey. And in this sharing, something inside her reorganized. For the first time, Melissa understood that the love we feel for someone who has passed doesn't need to be forgotten for another love to be born. They can coexist, as long as they don't try to occupy the same space. Despite this, there were still moments when the past crept in. Like that morning when Melissa found, in an old box of papers, a letter to Jonathan that had never been sent. It was a draft, written in the days immediately following their separation. In it, Melissa asked for forgiveness. But more than that, she exposed her soul with an almost childlike vulnerability, saying she didn't know who she was without him. That she was afraid of not being loved again. That her betrayal, though unforgivable, had not been born of contempt, but of confusion and need. She read the letter from beginning to end, and when she finished, she tore it up firmly. Not because it was no longer true, but because now she knew who she was without him. And that was enough. Across town, Jonathan was living his days with ease. Clara had received a job offer in another state, and they were both considering the move as a new chapter. Pedro was growing fast, curious, intelligent, with a sensitivity rare for his age. He called Jonathan Dad without needing to be forced. And Jonathan responded like one. Family evenings were peaceful, the conversations sincere, the future planned cautiously but hopefully. Still, every now and then, he found himself thinking about Melissa. Not with longing, but with a kind of melancholic respect. He knew the love he felt for her would never be repeated, because it had been unique. But he understood that life doesn't need to repeat feelings, it just needs to be taught. One day, as he was leaving work, he ran into an old mutual friend who commented, almost casually, on the texts he was reading on a blog. He described the writing, mentioned excerpts. Jonathan knew immediately it was Melissa. He said nothing. He just smiled and remained silent. That night, he searched the blog. He read dozens of texts. Some spoke of longing, others of guilt, but many spoke of rebirth. At the end of one, written with the strength of someone who has weathered storms, she said, "We don't choose who destroys the first part of our story. But we can choose with whom we rewrite the second." Jonathan closed the laptop and stared at the wall. He felt no anger. No sadness. Only pride. Because despite everything, she had learned. And that, somehow, was the only redemption possible. Days later, Melissa received a notification on her blog. A new comment. Signed simply, J. It said, "I read everything. I'm glad you found your voice. May it never be silent again." Melissa cried. Not with regret. But with gratitude. Because she understood that forgiveness doesn't need to be expressed in big words. Sometimes it comes as a quiet blessing, like a whisper in the midst of chaos. With Victor, Melissa began to live differently. There were no promises. Just daily choices. They began sharing weekends, cooking together, walking in silence for long minutes without needing to justify the pause. Gradually, intimacy took shape, not as urgency, but as comfort. And in that more mature, more conscious rhythm, she allowed herself to feel. And be felt. There was no longer fear of loss. There was surrender. And that, she now knew, is what makes love real. One afternoon, the two were sitting in a park, watching the reflection of the trees in a small lake. Victor took her hand and said, "Have you ever thought about telling your whole story? Not just on the blog, but as a book?" Melissa hesitated. Then smiled. "I think I'm writing it now. And maybe, this chapter isn't over yet." He squeezed her hand firmly and said, "Then write slowly. But don't stop writing." And she knew that, there, she had found what she never thought she would have again, a love that was possible. Not to erase the past. But to carry on. Because life doesn't expect us to be perfect. It only expects that, when we fall, we have the courage to get up. And keep living. And, who knows, maybe love better next time. Years had passed since that morning Melissa last saw Jonathan. Time didn't stand still for anyone. The world turned, the seasons changed, new stories began, and others, like hers, left scars that never faded, but also didn't hurt as much as before. Now they were just memories, like shadows that cross the skin without hurting, but leaving the mark of what was and what will never be again. Life had followed its course, without consulting wills, without offering shortcuts, simply forcing everyone to carry on, even when their hearts insisted on living trapped in what was left behind. Jonathan and Clara moved, as they had planned. They chose a small town, far from the hustle and bustle, where Pedro could grow up peacefully, surrounded by nature, affection, and stability. They set up a simple house with a garden and a balcony, and there they rebuilt their lives, far from the noise of the past. Jonathan now worked remotely, which gave him time to closely monitor Pedro's growth, from his homework to his most difficult questions about the world. The relationship with Clara blossomed even more after the move because they were both willing to avoid repeating mistakes, to care for each other with honesty, and above all, with kindness. The love between them was not built on the absence of flaws, but on the willingness to face each other even on difficult days. They didn't deny the past, but respected it as part of the path that brought them here. Jonathan no longer carried hurt feelings. There was no longer room for resentment. He had definitively understood that true love isn't the kind that never makes mistakes, but the kind that, even after pain, never loses the ability to love again. He hadn't forgotten Melissa, but now she inhabited a distant place, like someone who passed through life leaving traces but never lingering. Melissa, in turn, moved too. She left behind her house, her neighborhood, the places that held too many memories. She chose a smaller apartment near a tree-lined square, where she could walk with Victor in the late afternoons. The two had decided to keep separate homes, even though they were together, as a way to preserve their individuality and respect each other's timetables. There was no longer any urgency, no rush, no fear of loss. What existed was care. They learned to talk maturely, to listen attentively, to remain silent without indifference. Victor taught her that love doesn't need to hurt to be intense. And Melissa, little by little, allowed herself to build a new version of herself, more sensitive, more aware, freer from the shackles of guilt. She published a book with the blog's writings, under a pseudonym. The book became an unexpected success. Readers saw themselves reflected in every page, in every confession, in every line that spoke of pain, but also of rebirth. In a silent dedication, she wrote, "To the one who taught me that love, when it is true, does not need applause, only reciprocity." Even amidst the peace she had built, Melissa knew she would forever carry the weight of her choices. She knew she was responsible for losing the only man who ever loved her completely. She knew the pain she experienced was only part of what she caused. But she didn't victimize herself. Instead, she transformed that pain into purpose. She began giving lectures on conscious relationships, regrets, and rebuilding. She spoke about the importance of listening, presence, and mutual care before it's too late. She became an example not because she was perfect, but because she learned. And because she chose not to repeat it. One morning, while walking with Victor through the square, they saw a mother with her young son playing around a fountain. The boy ran back and forth, laughing, while his mother watched him tenderly. Melissa paused for a moment, observing the scene with a small smile. Victor gently pulled her hand and asked, "Do you want to have children someday?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at him, then at the boy running, and finally said, "Maybe. But not to fill a void. Only if it's to overflow." Victor smiled. And in that moment, they knew that, whatever path they took, they would do it together, hand in hand, with the maturity of those who have already understood that love is not destiny, it is choice. Jonathan, in his new routine, also found time for himself. He learned to play the guitar, something he'd always wanted to do but put off. One afternoon, sitting on the porch with Pedro playing beside him, he composed a simple yet soulful melody. Clara listened from the kitchen, moved. He wasn't singing for the past or the future, he was singing for the present, for the peace he'd found after weathering the storm. At the song's final note, Pedro ran up to him and said, "Dad, this is a happy song." Jonathan smiled. And with shining eyes, he replied, "Yes. Because now, our lives are too." Some time later, Melissa was invited to a literary event. At the end of the talk, a woman approached her and thanked her for one of the texts that had helped her escape a toxic relationship. She said she felt represented. Melissa thanked him, and when she was alone, she wrote in her notebook, "We are not only what we destroy. We are also what we choose to rebuild." And there, in that simple sentence, she concluded that perhaps her most important love story was with herself. Because forgiving yourself takes more courage than being forgiven. And moving on, even after loss, is the most sincere form of starting over. This was the story of a woman who had everything, lost it by not appreciating it, but learned. Of a man who loved truly, suffered, but was reborn. And of a love that didn't end as expected, but left lessons no one can erase. Because when you betray someone who truly loves you, it's not just the relationship that breaks down, it's the reflection of what was and what was no longer. If you've made it this far, please comment on what you thought of this story. Your opinion is very important. Subscribe to the channel to hear more impactful stories like this. And remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy the other person. It destroys yourself, your trust, your respect, your dignity, and what could have been the love of your life. It's not worth it. No adventure, no illusion, justifies the loss of someone who truly loved you. This channel does not support any kind of betrayal. Here, the truth is told so you never forget, who loves, cares. And who betrays, loses.